It's roughly 2150 BC, and you're standing on the bank of the Nile watching the water not rise. That's the whole crisis, right there, in one sentence. Every single year of your life, the river has flooded sometime around July, covered the fields, and pulled back in October, leaving behind the black silt that grows your food. This year, it barely moved. Last year, it barely moved. The year before that, same thing. You're watching a river quietly fail to do the one job an entire civilization was built around, and there is no backup plan, because there has never needed to be one until now. Somewhere upriver, a provincial governor is having stone carvers chisel his own name into a cliff face, bragging in permanent granite that nobody in his district starved to death this year. Read that twice. That was considered the single greatest achievement of his career. Not a military victory. Not a temple. Keeping people alive. Here's what the pyramids hide. We think of ancient Egypt as the safest bet in the ancient world. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, endless grain, endless gold, endless stability. Most of the time, that's genuinely true. But Egypt's entire existence was a bet on one single unpredictable variable, and every few centuries that bet came due. So today, what happened when the Nile simply didn't show up? A governor who ruled like a warlord to keep his people fed, an inscription describing 7 straight years of failure, tree rings from a coffin proving a drought nobody was supposed to survive, and a grain storage system so effective a version of it ended up in the Bible. Let's go. The bet underneath the whole civilization. Everything about Egypt runs on one number, the height of the Nile flood in a given year. Too low, and the water never reaches the outer fields, and the harvest fails. Too high, and it drowns villages and washes away the irrigation basins that took generations to build. The sweet spot historically sat somewhere around 15 to 16 cubits at Elephantine, roughly 7 or 8 meters. Miss that window in either direction and you don't get a bad year, you get a catastrophe, because there is no alternative water source for the crops. No rain to speak of, no second river, just the flood, once a year, and whatever it decides to do. To manage that terrifying amount of uncertainty, the Egyptians built devices called nilometers, stone staircases or graduated wells sunk directly into the riverbank, letting priests and officials read the exact water level in real time as the flood arrived. This wasn't ceremonial. It fed straight into state policy. A strong reading meant the granaries could plan for a big harvest and a heavier tax. A weak reading triggered decisions about rationing before a single stalk of grain had even grown. The nilometer was, in the most literal sense, Egypt's earliest economic forecasting instrument. And priests overseeing the readings weren't just praying over the water, they were feeding numbers directly into a bureaucracy that decided who got fed and how much everyone owed the state that year. For most of 3,000 years, it worked. Except when it didn't. 7 years of nothing. There's an inscription carved onto a granite boulder on the island of Sehel, near the first Nile cataract, that claims to record a message from King Djoser himself, ruler during Egypt's third dynasty, roughly 2650 BC. In it, the king describes his own despair. He says, more or less, that his heart was sad, that the palace was in grief, because the inundation had not come properly for 7 consecutive years. Grain scarce, kernels dried out, everything edible running short. Here's the honest caveat, and I want to give it to you straight. Egyptologists studying the language of that inscription have concluded it was actually composed centuries later, during the Ptolemaic period, and set in Djoser's reign retroactively, essentially a piece of historical fiction using a famous old king as the mouthpiece. So we can't take it as a literal eyewitness account of the third dynasty. What we can take from it is something almost more interesting. The idea of a 7-year famine was so culturally embedded in Egyptian memory that 1,000 years later, scribes were still writing stories about it, still setting them in the mouth of a king who'd been dead for 2 millennia, a trauma that outlived the event by a millennium, repeated so many times it calcified into folklore with a royal signature attached. And we don't actually need that inscription to prove the real famines happened, because we have better evidence, written by people who were actually there, the man who called himself the beginning and the end of humankind. Fast forward to around 2200 to 2150 BC, the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the era right after the pyramids at Giza, were finished. Something happened to the climate. Sediment cores, ice cores, and even tree rings pulled from a cedar coffin all point to the same conclusion: a sustained megadrought, roughly a 200-year stretch of reduced monsoon rainfall over the Ethiopian highlands, which is where the Nile's floodwater actually originates. Less rain there means less flood here, year after year, and the tightly centralized bureaucracy that had run Egypt for 500 years simply could not cope with a crisis that long. The Old Kingdom fragmented. Egypt split into competing regional territories. This period even has a name now, the First Intermediate Period, essentially Egypt's Dark Age. And in the middle of that collapse, we meet a nomarch, a provincial governor named Ankhtifi, ruling the districts of Hierakonpolis and Edfu in Upper Egypt. Ankhtifi had his autobiography carved into the walls of his own tomb at a site called El Moela, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary pieces of self-promotion to survive from the ancient world. He writes that all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, to the point that people were eating their own children, a claim modern historians treat with real skepticism. Ancient boasting texts loved hyperbole. But underneath the exaggeration is a description of genuinely functional crisis management. He claims he loaned grain to neighboring districts. He imposed rationing. He built temporary dams to hold back what little water there was. And in a detail that tells you everything about how dangerous this period actually was, he forbade people from leaving his territory, because a starving population that scatters is a population you can no longer feed, protect, or tax. His own words, carved permanently into rock, read, "I managed that no one died of hunger in this nome." And then, a few lines later, with a straight face, "I am the beginning and the end of humankind, for my equal has not and will not come into being." Let that sit for a second. In a functioning civilization, that line reads as delusional. In a starving one, apparently, it read as leadership, because the man saying it was, by his own account, the only reason your family still had bread. What the bones actually say. Here's where it stops being boastful inscriptions and becomes physical evidence. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletal remains from this period look for two specific markers: cribra orbitalia and parodic hyperestosis, both signs of chronic anemia and nutritional stress that show up as small pitted lesions in the eye sockets and skull. Populations excavated from sites like Gabati and areas around Elephantine show elevated rates of exactly these markers clustering around the First Intermediate Period. This isn't a scribe's exaggeration on a tomb wall. This is the skeleton itself keeping the receipts, decades after the mouth that would have complained about hunger went silent. There's also art. On the causeway leading to the pyramid of King Unas, right at the tail end of the Old Kingdom, there's a relief carving that Egyptologists consider one of the most haunting images to survive from ancient Egypt. A group of emaciated desert nomads, ribs visible, clearly starving. Some scholars read it as evidence that even before the Old Kingdom's formal collapse, climate stress along Egypt's desert margins was already visible enough that a royal artist felt compelled to carve it into a king's own funerary monument. A core sample from Saqqara even shows a full meter of dune sand sitting over what used to be arable fields, land the desert simply reclaimed once the water stopped coming. Egypt didn't hide its worst years. It carved them in stone next to a pharaoh's tomb for eternity. It didn't stop at the First Intermediate Period either. Egypt's records mention food shortages resurfacing during the late Middle Kingdom and into the Second Intermediate Period, likely tied to shifting flood patterns and the growing pressure of the Hyksos in the delta. Centuries after that, during the reigns of Merenptah and Ramesses III, Egyptian texts describe grain shortages coinciding with the broader collapse hitting the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, the same turbulent stretch that sent the so-called sea peoples migrating across the region looking for land that still produced food. The Nile wasn't a problem Egypt solved once. It was a problem Egypt kept solving, generation after generation, sometimes well and sometimes not, for the entire span of its existence. The system that actually worked, most of the time. So how did Egypt survive this, again and again, for 3,000 years, rather than simply collapsing every time the flood had a bad decade? The answer is grain storage, and it's a genuinely underrated piece of ancient engineering. From the Old Kingdom onward, the state and the major temples operated networks of granaries, mud brick silo complexes built with raised floors and thick walls to keep grain aerated, dry, and safe from rodents. Surplus collected through taxation in kind during good years sat in reserve, waiting to be redistributed the moment a nilometer reading came in low. By the New Kingdom, these had become genuinely massive operations. The mortuary temple of Rameses II at Thebes had its own vaulted granary complex attached, storing enough state grain to function as a buffer against exactly the kind of multi-year failure that broke the Old Kingdom centuries earlier. This system is famous enough that a version of it made its way into one of the most widely read texts in human history, the biblical account of Joseph advising Pharaoh to store surplus grain during 7 years of plenty ahead of 7 years of famine. Whether or not that specific story reflects a real event is a separate question historians still debate, but the underlying mechanism it describes, systematic state grain storage as insurance against Nile failure, is not folklore. It's documented Egyptian administrative practice, going back 1,000 years before that story was written down. But here's the catch, and it's the same catch that shows up in every centralized system ever built. The granaries only worked if the bureaucracy moving grain out of them kept working too. When central authority fragmented, as it did violently during the first intermediate period, having grain sitting in a warehouse 100 kilometers away did nothing for you if nobody could get it there. The storage solved the agricultural problem. It could not, by itself, solve a political collapse. Ankhtifi's entire claim to fame was that he personally kept that local link in the chain functioning when the wider system around him had already broken. Let's take a step back. Put the whole thing together, and you get 3 things stacked on top of each other. First, Egypt's stability was never really about the Nile being reliable. It was about how well the state could absorb the years it wasn't. Nilometers gave them early warning. Granaries gave them a cushion. That combination bought Egypt roughly 3,000 years of continuity that most ancient civilizations never got close to. Second, when that cushion failed, it failed catastrophically, and it failed because of governance as much as geography. The Old Kingdom didn't collapse because the Nile dropped. Plenty of societies survive bad rivers. It collapsed because a 200-year drought outlasted the bureaucracy's ability to keep redistributing what little grain existed, and once redistribution broke down, local strongmen like Ankhtifi stepped into the vacuum, which is exactly the pattern you'd expect. Food insecurity produces warlords, not by accident, but by mechanism. Third, and this is the one worth sitting with, the thing Egypt was proudest of during a famine was never a monument. It was the ordinary, unglamorous claim that nobody in your district starved. That's what Ankhtifi carved into eternal stone. Not a battle, not a temple. A grain ledger dressed up as a legacy. And there's a quieter fourth thing hiding underneath the first 3, which is that famine in Egypt was never purely a natural disaster. It always arrived as 2 overlapping failures at once. A bad flood and a system unable to absorb it, and you genuinely cannot separate the two when you're reading the evidence. A weak nilometer reading in a strong, functioning bureaucracy produced a hard year. The exact same reading, repeated for 2 centuries straight, in a bureaucracy already stretched thin by pyramid building costs and provincial rivalries, produced the collapse of a kingdom. The river never changed its behavior on its own terms. It was always the system around it that decided whether a low flood became a footnote or a catastrophe. Here's what I keep coming back to. Somewhere around 2150 BC, a governor stood in front of a starving province and made a decision that had nothing to do with gods or pyramids. Whether to open the grain stores, whether to close the borders, whether to ration bread that wasn't his to ration. He got it right, or at least right enough. And 32 centuries later, his own words are still legible on a cliff wall in Upper Egypt. The single sentence he apparently wanted remembered above everything else, that no one died of hunger on his watch. Everything else about him, the boasting, the self-declared greatness, the claim to be humankind's beginning and end, all of it faded into background noise the moment modern archaeologists actually read the wall. That one line didn't. So, question for you. Would you trust a nilometer reading and a warehouse full of grain to get your family through 7 bad years in a row? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.